So in Psalm 110, David is going to elaborate on the authority of heaven's chosen messianic king with several callbacks to Psalm 2, but David offers some clarification and some extra detail about that messianic king that was referenced in Psalm chapter 2. So God's chosen messianic king is heaven's response to the escalating rage of the nations. David records God's statement to the messianic king, starting right here in verse 1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Now, this one verse is the most quoted Old Testament verse in all of the New Testament, quoted very, very regularly. According to Jewish tradition, the messianic king must be seated at God's right hand in heaven until the earth is cultivated for optimal deliverance. And this gets mentioned over and over and over as a reference to Jesus. This is all the way from the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, all the way through, clarifies over and over again that Jesus, according to the New Testament, is this figure. I've included this in the notes in Ephesians chapter 1, starting in verse 20, mentioning that Christ was raised from the dead and seated with God at God's right hand in heavenly places, Ephesians 1 verse 20, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the age to come, which is what we're talking about right now. Directly referencing, calling back to this promise that David wrote 1,000 years before in Psalm 110. And I love that this little phrase and this reference to Psalm 110 there in Ephesians 1 gives a eschatological, which means end of the age context to David's prayer in Ephesians 1, 16 and 17 and following into these verses. So that's pretty cool. There's no other potential messianic figure known of or even theorized of that could fulfill this piece of criterion. This criterion for the messianic figure to be seated with God in heavenly places, there's nobody else who has been crucified, resurrected, ascended into heaven, and promises to return and fulfill these messianic promises straight to Jerusalem to fulfill everything that we're reading about here. The New Testament makes a really strong case, and like I said, I just gave you one reference, but there's many others that reference this historically to Jesus. All right, so verses 2 through 4, let me make sure I scroll up a little bit so you can see all of these. There we go. Verses 2 through 4, the Lord says, the Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter, rule in the midst of your enemies. Now, Zion is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And verse 3 is a very challenging one for commentators and scholars to translate and interpret. Moses' writings and earlier Psalms reference Jewish captives that are liberated by the Messiah during his procession to Jerusalem. And later prophets do support this interpretation by describing Jewish survivors as supernaturally strengthened to defeat Israel's enemies alongside their warrior king. And so I think it's a good suggestion that this is what David's referring to in verse 3, where he says, your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments, meaning they have this restoration and renewal that's happening as their Messiah is liberating them from captivity, and they're accompanying him in his procession to Jerusalem to defeat Israel's enemies. Again, though, there's very little certain agreement among scholars on exactly what all that means, because the translation of that is pretty difficult. But again, the Lord has sworn, meaning from heaven, this is heaven's declaration over their Messiah, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And that's super interesting. Did I have that up there? Oh yeah, good. You can see that. The order of Melchizedek is a very specific promise and a little bit of a mysterious figure. The Messianic king being belonging to the order of Melchizedek. Well, Melchizedek is found back in Genesis 14. And little is really exactly sure about the identity of Melchizedek, other than, I'll just read you the reference from Genesis 14. And Melchizedek was king of Salem, which is the precursor to Jerusalem. That's kind of the settlement that becomes Jerusalem, which again is named after that Hebrew word for peace, Shalom. It really is the root of Salem. Melchizedek was king of Salem, which is at the time of Abraham. I mean, this is a long time ago. Brought bread and wine because he was the priest of the Most High God. So he's the king of Jerusalem and he's priest of the Most High God. Now in Hebrew tradition, those are two separate roles. But before there was any law, before the time of Moses, back in the time of Abraham, there's this Melchizedek figure who is both king and high priest, which again is super mysterious because there is no kingdom in Jerusalem and no law to be a high priest of. So it's interesting. David calls this back, directly referencing Melchizedek as a characteristic of the expected Messiah. Now, Hebrews chapter 5 through 7 in the New Testament offer a lot more perspective and context to Jesus' identity as a messianic king of Psalm 110 in the order of Melchizedek. So we'll probably look at Hebrews 5 through 7 in some later weeks. But anyway, I put that there as a little reference if you want to dive a little bit deeper into really what David's referencing right here in verse 4. All right, let's move on. Verses 5 through 7. The Lord is at your right hand. There we go. Yeah, so you can see those there. Again, Psalm 110 verses 5 through 7 really are describing heaven's divine might that reinforces the Messianic king's battle against Israel's enemies. So he's saying the Lord is at your right hand, meaning the Lord, heaven, is supernaturally supporting Israel's Messiah as he arrives in Jerusalem to do what? To shatter the kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations. Again, one of the things I love about verse 3 is this is describing the day of his power, the day of God's power, really the day of the Messiah's power at the day of Israel's deliverance. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter the kings on his day of wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. And he will drink from the brook by the way, therefore he will lift up his head, which really is another statement of he'll be well supplied, he'll be refreshed, he'll be victorious, lifting up his head across the earth. It's kind of interesting in verses 5 through 6, kind of the shattering of kings is another reference back to Psalm 2. In Psalm 2, verse 9, it says, the Messiah will dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. And it just, again, iterating that the strength of the opposition against the covenant is brittle and fragile, and the Messianic king is just breaking them apart, shattering them like pots. So again, another reference back to Psalm 2 that sounds very similar to what David is saying here in Psalm 110. And I've included those little references there in the notes so you can see those together. All right, that's going to do it for now for Psalm 110. That is a remarkable thing to pair with Psalm 2. We talked about Psalm 2 last week, so if you want, you can go back and look at the recording and the notes from last week and then compare it with Psalm 110. It's a pretty cool thing to see. What do we have up next?